It's 7 o'clock in Manitoba, 5 o'clock on the Pacific Coast, and 8 o'clock in Eastern Canada. It is Wednesday, April the 10th, and because it's Wednesday, it's Farm to Market, Episode 2, with my co-host and very knowledgeable reporter, Harry Siemens, as he brings us the goods on what's happening. We're going to talk about a few interesting things, so stay tuned here as we get into our programming here. Well, good evening. My name is Karl Krebs. I'm the host of Things That Matter, and we want to talk about some things that really do matter. And in our episode 2 of Farm to Market, we're going to talk about what's driving the issues behind the scenes. Why are we seeing such high food prices? And what's playing out that's going to eventually make its head and make itself known? And we're going to see the effects of that. And I am pleased to welcome back my co-host, Harry Siemens, as he is going to fill us in on what's going on. Welcome to the show, Harry. How you doing, my friend?
You know what? Doing okay. It's great. I mean, the weather is pretty good, and so I'm still doing this at 77 years young, and it's been 53 years that I'm a farm journalist. Started way back in April of 1971, and so you know what? The good Lord has been awesome. And I have followed him, and I've just continued to work, as I've told you last week, and I always like to repeat it. You know, first of all, I like to tell the story of farming one farmer at a time, and I do that lots. Secondly, I'm a journalist, and I like to be accurate. Doesn't mean everything is always exactly the way people would like it. And thirdly, I'm a farmer's advocate. And that doesn't mean I agree with a lot of farmers. In my early rookie years as a farm broadcaster, Karl, I would have people call me up and say, Harry, how could you say that? I said, you know what? My recorder is rolling. Keep talking.
Yeah, exactly. You know what? There's what people want to hear, and then sometimes there's what they need to hear. And we want to balance that. It's kind of balancing it between truth and love, you know. I've often said, that the truth without love is very harsh. But love without truth is sentimentality, and we don't want to play it up or play it down. But I think what we're going to try to do here as we go from episode to episode is highlight the fact that how important our farmers is, how important the farmers are, and that when we look at farmers, they're often, caught in the middle. And when we look at the changes that are occurring on the average farm, whether it's a small, medium, or large, it tends to be now either extremely small or extremely large. I think the middle is gone. But we want to advocate for farmers as great tenants of the land, as good caretakers of the land.
Yes, and you know what? Absolutely. And people sometimes have talked to me and said, why do you just interview and do stories on the big farmers? Well, I don't. But at the same time, what was a small farmer, a number of years ago is a bigger farmer today, but still the same farmer, still the same farm. And so we have, and that's the myth that I would like to disqualify right now.
You want to debunk it. You want to debunk that stuff.
Debunk the fact that we've got corporate farmers. The only way we really have corporate farmers is like my brother Jack, who incorporated a number of years ago. He farms 1,800 acres with his son. They did it for tax reasons and whatever else. So he's a corporate family farm. And for the most part, that's what we have across Western Canada. Sure, we've got bigger companies coming in. They buy up land, they rent it to farmers. But for the most part, where the real production, the real farmers, the people that are feeding the people around the world. And I always go back to my good friend Orion Samuelson, turned 90 on March 31st. He's in Scottsdale, Arizona, farm broadcasted 46 years at a WGN Chicago. And he was my mentor from 1978 on. And he says, Harry, serving agriculture, the basic renewable industry, is such an absolute joy and blessing and an honor. And that's how
Yeah.
I feel today.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I asked you to join me on this segment, because of your vast knowledge, your experience, and the ability to look at it and step back from it and report it as it's actually happening for what it is, not beholding to anybody. That's one of the questions I asked you. Are you beholding to anybody as you report? And you chuckle and laugh and said, no, I guess only God, I suppose, huh?
Yes, you know what, and a lot of people think, I'm far richer than I am as far as money is concerned, but I'm very blessed and rich with the work that I've been able to do. From since 1985, I worked from home. I had my office from home, so it didn't matter whether we lived in Plum Coulee, Altona, or Winkler, or Winnipeg, or I traveled to Europe or wherever. My laptop was my office, and I could do it from wherever. And with technology, and I embraced it early, 1982, my first computer, and I've always stayed on the cutting edge. And my tagline also is, on the edge with Siemens Says, and that's where I've always loved to be.
I love the moniker Siemens Says. It reminds me of the game that we used to play, Simon Says. So cute little thing. So we've got a story tonight we want to share with you that are watching now and will possibly be watching later. It is a story that is already in play in Oregon with the Oregon farmers. And to get us going, I've got a 3-minute clip here that I want to play for you guys. And then we're going to jump into this, because this is already happening in Oregon. It isn't kind of a fear or a conspiracy or something that people think might happen. It's playing out. So let's have a listen to what this farmer in Oregon is reporting, and then let's get in.
It seems like these types of stories are starting to become so prolific, you could almost do a video a day on this stuff. But today I wanted to talk about the state of Oregon. And I know that some of you are probably thinking, this is Oregon, this is what happens in Oregon. But hear me out on this, because a lot of these things kind of start in some of these states, and then you start seeing them spread to other states. Okay, so the state of Oregon has effectively shut down small farms and market gardens on a large scale. And they're actually sending out cease and desist letters to farms, and they're using satellite technology to find their victims and then send them these letters and say, you can't operate. And they're doing it in the name of water conservation, groundwater protection. So there are two different laws that they're using to this effect. And I wanted to just mention those laws with a couple of these cases so that you get an idea of how they're being interpreted and utilized to shut down small farms. Okay, so I found a court case that was filed in January of this year. And it basically, in the National Review, there was an article that said, Oregon's government and dairy industry join forces against small farmers. And what they're doing in the state of Oregon is they've redefined what a CAFO is. And this doesn't just apply to small dairy farmers. This applies to people who have chicken houses, who have goat farms, basically anybody who has a barn or a facility that has a gravel or concrete floor. I will actually read to you what the definition is, and then we'll talk about how it's been impacting some people. According to Oregon, a CAFO, or a confined animal feeding operation, CAFO. The state of Oregon defines CAFOs as the concentrated feeding or holding of animals or poultry, including but not limited to a horse, cattle, sheep, or swine feeding areas, dairy confinement areas, and poultry and egg production facilities where the surface has been prepared with concrete, rock, or fibrous material to support animals in wet weather. That is what they define as a CAFO. And so what's happening in Oregon, and why the small dairies have filed a lawsuit against the state, and really I think from the list that you just heard me read, anybody who's producing eggs, it doesn't matter the size of the operation. You could have 2 milking cows. It's
So, Harry, let's break this down for our listeners. We don't want to assume that they understand. I have never heard the term CAFO, but in that description, I can think of people that are doing that. Perhaps we call them hobby farmers. Perhaps they're just small producers that sell locally. But there's several things in there that could easily apply to Canada. And I like the way he says it. What's happening here in Oregon, but we have this overarching theme that's playing out, and what's happening in other parts of the world is sometime at some place in time making its way to our country. So you've dived a little deeper into this article. That's a 3-minute clip of a 20-minute presentation, but give us the goods on this, Harry. There's a lot here to break down.
Well, first and foremost, like you said last time, said this time, we're not here just to fearmonger. We're here to set the record straight so that people can understand it. Number one is, yes, I mean, I read of two ladies that were running a little dairy farm, 3 cows. And yet it was the big farmer that complained to government saying, hey, they should be under the same rules that we are. So now they're supposed to spend $100,000 to bring their own system up to speed so that it looks after whatever needs to be looked after. And so that is number one, that it's a small farm. And yeah, 3 cows is something that, my dad had 1 cow, 2 cows. But at the same time, it goes to the bigger farmers, not big, but at the same time, it means that they can't afford to pay the $100,000 to upgrade. So they got to cease and desist, right? They can't do it. And so 3 cows can sell milk, cream, whatever, butter to neighbors. But now those people can't do it. Those 2 ladies don't use all that milk for themselves. They're spreading it out. And so
right.
You take one farmer, you take another farmer. And so it's basically a law that government puts together so that they can do these things to people like that. A lot of things, a lot of people don't realize it, but there's a huge attack on livestock production. Number one, whether it's pigs, whether it's poultry, whether it's cattle or dairy, people want to get rid of those animals. Secondly, they want to do what they can to make things more or less efficient for the bigger farmers. We've come through in Canada where some time it happened in Alberta, it happened in BC, where they had sit-ins, protests, right inside a Hutterite turkey barn. And I have the pictures. I was there, and I wasn't there, but I was there via video. And so, yeah, and at that time it was the premier that came out and they put a law in place that they couldn't do that again. But you know what? You come today with all the diseases that are out there and you have a sit-in like that. So all I'm saying is that there's one thing where they do it with water. There's another place where they can do it with production. And here in Manitoba, we have an organization called Hog Watch. And they're watching and trying to blame everything that happens in the lakes on hog production. And because they want to do away with hog production. So
right. It's an unfair assessment of blame. But I'm hearing what you're saying. And if you retrace the steps, these issues where they're raising the compliance level to an unaffordable level. And of course, nobody would do that. As you said in your example there, you wouldn't invest $100,000. You're suddenly out of the game. Well, we're starting to then play with supply and demand, right? We're shrinking that supply down. The demand remains the same. The prices will go up. And all of these things that have their origin in some form of animal activists or some form of climate change or some form of water concerns, conservation, are then playing themselves out in the prices we're seeing. Can it be any other way, Harry?
Protectionism is the other one. And we
There you
talked
go.
about it
Another
again.
one I missed. Yeah.
Yeah, we talked about it before we came on. We have today, and I'm just writing this story, or I was just before we came on air, mandatory country of origin labeling. Not mandatory, that's what it used to be. But now it's a voluntary. And what does it mean? It means that the U.S. government, the biggest meat seller in the world is the U.S. government, to the school program, to the armed forces, and wherever else they may sell it. So they're now saying that if you want to have the product of the U.S. on your meat label as a processor, you have to have the pig, the calf, the egg hatched in the United States. And it has to be born, raised, and processed in the United States in order to have the country of origin, or the made in the U.S. Products of the U.S. And
Yeah,
so,
well, the all coveted USDA approved label, which appears,
yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
on that.
And,
So let's just back up for a second here. I want to finish off with the Oregon issue here. Another thing he mentions in there, Harry, is farm markets, like local farm markets. And I know from living where we live in Winkler, Manitoba, there's a lot of local farm markets. People that produce their harvest in the season that we have, and then bring it to the market and sell it. When we get into, and in this later in this interview, or in this presentation, he talks about water metering and the fact that they are going to control how much water you use and having to get permit for it. If that comes into any market, it's going to have devastating effects on the small producers. And he mentions in this article that the drop of in number of small producers is in the area of 2 million to far less than 2 million small independent farmers in the United States. All of this has this shrinking effect when we bring in all of this control and protectionist kind of attitudes. So again, Harry, the farmer, the one that we typically know, is a great tenant of his land, but still they raise the bar to a level where he can't compete. What's going to happen in the end? He folds up his tent. He goes away. He sells his land because Bill Gates is buying land like nobody else in the United States. I guarantee you that we're not going to get cattle grazing on that land that Bill Gates owns.
You're absolutely right, because I saw a video just 2 days ago where he talks about artificial meat. And because artificial meat is something that takes away from, again, from farmers raising livestock and cattle. And so that's a whole another issue that we could get into at a future date. But let me just say one other thing. In Alberta last year, where they've had a drought for 3 or 4 years, right in the heart around Lethbridge, Medicine, where they grow potatoes, they had irrigation. Well, people need the water in cities. So they cut irrigation by half. And they already had a drought, so they cut irrigation by half. And I'm not saying they shouldn't have, because they were dry. But at the same time, we are so reliant on government giving permits that they can pretty well do what you like. You take Lake Minnewaska at Morden. I mean, right now they are back almost to normal because of that runoff, snow runoff. But they were in a drought situation, and they could not shower as often as they would like to most of the winter. Why? Because the lake was so low, and I've flown it for the last 3 years. I've gone with my friend flying, and it was really low. But again, the government has control, and they can tell you exactly. And the really key thing is, as they did in Oregon, they're using satellite, whatever, in order to detect where these little farmers so-called are, and we can do that wherever. And then they can just put the law to you, and they say, okay, you can't do it. You can't shower. And then before you know it, you got somebody coming in at the who knows what time and sees are you showering or not? I'm just using that as
Well,
an
Harry,
example.
now you're getting onto something that I was a part of a podcast on, or was a webinar. But they were talking about the new meters that the city of Winnipeg has voted and approved to be installed in every home. These meters are nothing more than spy detection on the people as to how much water they're using in the moment they're using it. And with concerns over security, you know that if the highest levels of military can be hacked, they can certainly hack in and find out who's not home and when is would be an opportune time to break in. It's kind of crazy the amount of surveillance. And this is when we get back, when we retrace the steps here, we're talking about ultimate control in the falsehood of protecting and in preserving what is not even necessarily under threat. In this article, it was really funny. He referenced someone who made a statement that water is not a renewable resource. I thought, what planet did you fall from?
Well, totally. Exactly. I mean, and that's why agriculture, farming, I love it. It's a renewable resource. But if you put controls, as Trudeau talked about 2 years ago, they kind of backed off talking about it publicly, but they were going to, maybe get farmers to cut back 20, 25% on fertilizer use, so we don't have the whatever use.
Well, you said earlier off before we came on live that a 30% reduction in the use of fertilizer would end it for people. It'd end it for the farmer.
Especially for the middle-sized farmer. Absolutely. And at this point, it wasn't so much the 30%, but it doesn't matter. Will it be 20%? Will it be 15%? 30%? Before you know it, it's like the carbon tax. It started where? And now we're up here. And before we know
23% increase as of April 1. For those of you that have maybe joined us late, I'm talking with Harry Siemens, a 53-year veteran in ag producing. And the purpose of Farm to Market, this new segment on Things That Matter, is to perhaps give you a little more contrast, a little more background as to what's driving the price of our food up in the market, because eventually all of what we're talking about here manifests itself in higher prices. And food, shelter, and clothing are your three staples you cannot do without. And we're living now in a time where we're just astounded at the cost of produce in the market. Whether you have to buy, whether you purchase it in meat or in your other staple items, it's astonishing to see the rise in the price. So what we're talking about here, Harry, is all coming in an ugly way to manifest itself in those prices.
In California, we have Proposition 12, and I alluded to it last week.
Yeah.
But I saw some more statistics since then. And Proposition 12 means that the sows giving birth to weanlings, baby pigs, they've had to go to 25 feet instead of wherever it was before. But not only pigs produced in California, whatever pork comes into California has to be produced under those numbers. So I've been trying to find out who's doing it, because right now California consumes 10% of all the pork in the United States. So it's got to come from elsewhere because they only produce 1%. And so now the consumption of pork has dropped by at least 2%, maybe 3%. The price of pork in California has gone up 20%.
Wow.
Because of Proposition 12. And we have many of those same propositions, proposals in the different states. In fact, we have one in Colorado, which is looking at eliminating the processing plants in Denver. And these are chicken processing plants. Why? Because exactly for that reason. And so we have to have the industry. We've got organizations that represent poultry producers, dairy producers, cattle producers, and especially pig producers in the United States that need to be vigilant as to seeing what kind of proposition are they bringing up. And they're starting in the schools, just like we used to do 4-H and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So they come out with one proposition that's way over the top. Well, the next time it comes down a little bit, but now they've already been accustomed to it. we have one, and I have this in very good terms from a person that told me about this. There's even one state in the U.S. where there's one proposition somewhere down the line. It's not nearly here yet, but where it'll be illegal to produce or to kill an animal for food production.
Yeah.
Illegal. You know, and
Yeah, this is the kind of insanity. And, you know, we've been living in this insane kind of mentality, in this utopian kind of mentality of people who think that they can reorganize the world and make it a better place. And what we're seeing here is the staples of life are in jeopardy. All of the legislation and all of what certain people who have influence and power are trying to do is going to create a crisis of people not being able to afford to feed their families, and a severe restriction in the market that it's just simply not available.
Totally. And I've been there. I mean, I've come through farming way back from 1965. When 1967 everything looked like it was great. In 1970 it wasn't that great. But that had to do with people in the world weren't buying. You know, we had too much production. But at the same time, farmers were in trouble. And then when we had mandatory country of origin labeling in the United States back from 2011, the hog industry in Canada just about disappeared. And we had to really work hard at getting back. And then we had Gary Doer, who was the premier in 2011. He brought in a restriction that had to do with animal units regarding pigs on farms. And that meant that from 2011 till, we talked about it a little bit last year, but I've got more detail. From 2011 to 2015, farmers could not increase production by one pig in Manitoba. I'm not kidding you. And it just about
we have a real case of this little piggy didn't go to market. He didn't even have a chance. He's not even in existence. One pig.
Even a hog farmer who wanted to expand or build a new barn. Well, he couldn't afford to build a new barn because he couldn't put more pigs into it. And so that was a real problem. We didn't have expansion for 15 years in a stretch going back just because of that. And now finally we're seeing some of that. And I'm still, I'm got my fingers crossed. I'm not holding my breath as I see news releases from the NDP government, and I'm not here to knock them at this point. I'm going to give them the benefit.
We'll do that when the opportunity is ripe.
Yeah, but I'm seeing 4 and 5 news releases every day coming out of the Manitoba government, and it's got lots of things. Right now we got mussels or whatever. We've got these things in the Clear Lake, and they're talking about shutting down Clear Lake, and so that people can't use boats in Clear Lake. And so
yet we have had these points of entry into the province that have had boat inspections on for years. It's everywhere in the U.S. I travel extensively, as people know, and I see them all the time. Let's, in the remaining minutes that we have here, let's talk about where this, again, feeding it back, because everything has its origin somewhere. And I'm going to start with a fact that in 2016, when Donald Trump took the helm in the United States, and he said he issued a decree that for every new environmental law that came on, 2 had to come off. Are we at that point, Harry, where we've got to really look at this and say, if you want to bring that law on, we've got to have some sort of overwatch that says 2 got to come off? Because what we're talking about here are people that are far removed from the farm and where the action happens, and eventually the produce that makes its way to the market. But do we have a case here where it's really back there in some office with some, pardon the expression, pencil neck geek maybe, who is putting in laws?
As I said last week, Ted Menzies, who was a member of parliament, he told me that in Ottawa, it's not the Department of Agriculture that sets the tone. It's Environment Canada. And they're setting the tone. And we have at least 110 non-government agencies that are on a committee. Farmers make up a very small part of it. And those are the guys for the last 2, 3, how many years under Trudeau have been setting the policies regarding environment and coming up with ideas on how farmers should farm. They're not listening to the farmers. Yeah, they're trying to make their points. But that's really a big problem where we have bigger farm organizations and they're involved in such a committee and they can have some input. But when it comes right down to it, the laws and the regulations, they can come from Environment Canada, and then we'll have to wait and see. You're absolutely right. If we don't watch what we're doing on one side, they'll take it away on the other.
So we're going to, at some point, and I don't suspect it'll be that much longer, go to a federal election. And of course, there's a lot of campaigning that Pierre Poilievre is doing, axe the tax and everything. And I know we touched on it last week, but I don't think we can say it enough. When he comes to us and tells us how he's going to do that, he really needs to go mining deeper and get to the source of where this agenda is being driven. And that is people that have the ear of the government for whatever selfish ambitions or ultimate agenda they have that is going to eventually come at us from another thing. If he does axe the tax, if he even does it, what's coming behind it?
Well, that's really what Ted Menzies was trying to tell me. You know, it's one thing to move around some people, but where is it coming from? I mean, we've got the World Economic Forum, we have the European Community Environmental Committee, and so much of it's coming from there. And I sometimes believe that Trudeau has been playing to that crowd with his tax and so forth. And so you're absolutely right. We're going to have to be careful what it is, you know, and I have asked Pierre on Twitter many times. I said, you axe the tax, but what are you going to do with climate change and how are you going to handle that? Because axing the tax is nothing compared to what is coming down the pike when it comes to how we're going to have to farm down the road.
Yeah, it very much represents a real threat to farmers who are going to be deemed in some ways unsuitable to manage the resources that they have managed for centuries, for generation after generation. And here you have some person with that agenda coming in and saying, well, no, we've tested the water on your property and it's not up to the standard that it is. And suddenly the ball's in play, you know, suddenly it moves slowly, but it does come. And this kind of legislation that we just talked about in Oregon is a real soft sell. It comes at you from your blind side. Oh, we're going to have to control water. Well, that sounds good on the surface, but how far you go with it depends on who it's going to affect in the end.
Yeah, and we'll cover this part of the next part of the topic I'm just going to introduce today, and that's the one on hemp production. Right now, as of March 15th, that's when farmers have had to sign up as if they're going to be growing hemp in Canada. And so they have satellite monitors, you know, indicating how much of the carbon is releasing from your soil. And so, and when you have that, the next step is you get paid to grow hemp, and then you get paid on the basis that it goes to a processor, and where that then goes from there depends on how much that farmer gets. But I'm going to do a bit more research on that one so I can talk more confidently, because I'm just writing that story as we speak.
Right. Thank you so much, Harry. I think we've already set the page, a tone for next week's call, and I'll give you a clue on this because we were talking before we came live that you might be surprised who is the ultimate buyer of it. And you might have it in your home in the form of furniture. Yeah. So we'll leave you with that. Just a little tease. Harry, thank you for being with us again. We're looking forward to having you next week again.
Thank you very much. And you know what? That Siemens says, somewhere, sometime, somehow, I'll see you again.
You betcha. Thanks, Harry. All right. We're closing it out here. We're a little past the 30-minute mark. But I thank you for watching, and sharing this out is important. We're not here to drive a huge audience, but we are here to be relevant and give you some information that you might not otherwise hear. And of course, in Canada, it's very restrictive on what can be shared. This kind of a story would be hard to share because we have very tough censorship laws in Canada. So we'll be back next week with another episode of Farm to Market with Harry. Just upcoming tomorrow, we have 30 minutes of Doc Talk with my co-host and colleague, Judy Fries, and we have some very interesting things to say here in the line of healthcare products, women and men. You don't want to miss that. Join us here tomorrow at 7 p.m. My name's Karl Krebs, and those are some of the things that matter. God bless you wherever you are.